Good morning, everyone. My name is Greg Levine, and I'd like to welcome you to our May speaker series. I'm personally super excited for today's talk. We really have a good one lined up for you today. So as is traditional, I would like to announce our next session, which will be on how to spot greenwashing and the unstoppable rise of ethical business. You know, COVID has been the great accelerator and has shown us all what a fragile planet we live on. So this talk will really explore the increasing prominent role that businesses are playing in building a more sustainable future for us all. And our guest will be thought leader on the subject, Professor Matthew Gitsem, who is the director of the Ashbridge for Business and Sustainability. He will be interviewed by our recently appointed Chief Sustainability Officer, Deepak Jabanputra. Now, this is taking place on the 1st of July at 10 a.m., so I suggest you all diarise it now. So now moving on to today's special session. A while back, I shared a story when a friend asked me, when will we go back to normal? And I responded, never. We will never go back to normal. We need to go forward to normal. The reality is that the COVID epidemic has fundamentally changed the dynamics of society, and more so in the workplace than anywhere else. And yesterday, we proudly released a report that was produced in partnership with the RSA titled Healthy Hybrid, a Blueprint for Business. And I have to say, what an incredible read. It is just so relevant, so real. As an advisor, as an individual, one can relate to so many of the insights that we have actually put forward in the report. The work dynamics, the cultural challenges, and even for me on a personal level, the sore neck and back linked to bad posture seems to be so much more common than I thought. As professionals, as individuals fueled by curiosity, this is truly an outstanding read. And today, our guest is Matthew Taylor, who is the CEO of the RSA and co-author of this report. And he'll be interviewed by Sir Craig Oliver, the principal for Teneo. And they will explore what the future of the workplace looks like and how it will evolve. The report explores the impact of COVID-19 crisis on workplace well-being, the need to balance the best of both worlds when it comes to remote working and, of course, returning to work. What I really love most about the report is it's actually really simple and highlights 10 key recommendations for businesses implementing a healthy hybrid way of working. As you can guess and as you can hear, I'm massively motivated to listen and learn from Matthew. So Craig, over to you, and I look forward to hear all your incredible insights. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Greg, and it's great to be here today. As Greg said, Vitality joined up with the RSA to produce a fascinating report on hybrid working. It feels incredibly timely because many businesses and workers are trying to assess how this new normal will work as we approach a complete reopening on the 21st of June. What are the pluses and minuses of hybrid working? And crucially, how should a caring, thoughtful employer with an inevitable eye on the bottom line act in this brave new world? We're incredibly fortunate to have Matthew Taylor of the RSA with us today to help us unpack the report, understand its implications, and crucially, help us understand how employers should work in the future. But before we talk, let me remind you that you can put your questions here too. Just on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a chat function. If you put some questions in there, I'll put them to Matthew Taylor as we go on. Matthew, welcome. Let's start with where we find ourselves. All things being equal, we should reopen fully and be out of lockdown on June the 21st. Try to sum up how significant a moment this is for the world of work.
Well, I guess, Craig, and it's great to be here, by the way. After 15 years, this will be my final external event as Chief Executive of the RSA, because I'm finishing tomorrow and going to run the NHS Confederation. And I say that because these issues of health and work are actually just as relevant to the new role I've got working with the health services to the RSA. And I'm very proud of this piece of work that the RSA has done with Vitality. Well, look, Craig, you know, it's the real test, isn't it? Up until now, everything has been a bit hypothetical. People have been asked, what will you do when lockdown ends? What will you do as employers? What will you do as employees? And so all that talk we've had, you know, here specifically in relation to this issue of kind of flexible good, healthy working, but also more broadly, this kind of narrative about building back better, we'll find out what is going to endure, what is going to persist, what has changed forever, what has only changed temporarily, and we will start to find out in earnest in June.
So let's take a step back. Can we give a definition of hybrid working? Is it just as simple as working at home and working in the office part of the week, or is it more complicated than that?
Yeah, I think that's the real power of this report, Craig, is that, yes, purely speaking, hybrid working simply means that people have a job in which they combine working from home and working in the office, and possibly working in somewhere else, maybe a local workspace which they share with other people in their neighborhood or whatever it might be. So basically, it simply means it breaks the correlation between having a job and having to be attending a particular workplace. But in this report, with the concept of healthy hybrid, I think what we're trying to argue is that this notion of hybrid needs to be connected to questions about value. Value in terms of what is it we want, what is it we value as a society, what do we want work to be like, but also questions of value in relation to employers. How do they best get the value out of hybrid working in a way which is good for them and for their workers? So what we're trying to do in this report is take hybridity away from simply being a kind of basic, almost a kind of negative description. It is not having to be in the office because you have a job, into a much more positive idea of what could hybrid working carry with it in terms of our aspirations for good work.
And in very simple and broad terms, what's clear is that there are upsides to being in an office and downsides, and upsides to being at home and downsides to being at home. Is it worth spelling those out a bit, and what you found when you sort of studied that?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting about it is that people's account of hybrid working during the lockdown has been mixed. Although I guess it hasn't really been hybrid working, it's been entirely working from home. So people's account of working from home during the lockdown has been mixed. So one of the big issues, two of the really big issues, I think, well, no, three big issues are, first of all, it looks like people have been working harder, not just working for those bits of time which they used to spend commuting, but doing even more than that, kind of 3 or 4 hours a week extra. So there's been an intensity of work, and people have felt greater anxiety about their work. But that may be connected, of course, to the broader context, worries about the economy, worries about the sustainability of the firm they work for or whatever. There have been these issues that Greg referred to around the equipment that we've got at home. I've had to move. When we were talking a few minutes ago, Craig, I was in my kitchen in a good chair, but then the Wi-Fi link's not that strong, so I've moved into the front room and I'm perched on the sofa, which is, it's fine for the purposes of this conversation. But so there's evidence, quite a lot of evidence of issues around people's back pain, neck pain, musculoskeletal issues. So that's been an issue as well. And also many people have found it difficult to balance work with the caring responsibilities. It's been particularly challenging for parents. And let's recognise, Craig, as blokes, that it looks as though the traditional division of labour has been reinforced, because overall men say they've been less inhibited in their productivity by caring responsibilities, and women say they have been more. Men say they are less conflicted by having to work and look after kids or other people than women are. So, and that's an important issue, Craig, because as we go forward and we think about this notion of healthy hybrid working, which for the RSA as a progressive organisation is related to our commitment to inclusion and social justice, one of the things we're going to have to look at is how does this impact differentially? And we saw examples of that during lockdown. Of course, that if you're a child who's got a space that you can work in and you've got good Wi-Fi and good computer, then you got through lockdown, you carried on learning. If you're sharing a flat with lots of other people, there's only one computer, it's a completely different experience. And hybrid working, similarly, we're going to have to watch carefully to make sure that it isn't the case that, for example, a lot more women than men do it because it enables them to combine caring responsibilities, and that leads in due course to further differentiation between women's career paths and men's career paths. So that's one of the bits of learning we're going to have to do as we go forward.
So there's a bit of sort of understanding and empathy about where workers are in their life, and that's going to be quite different. So I found during lockdown, for example, I've got older children, space, good solid Wi-Fi, that kind of thing. That was great. But a lot of people who are working it today, maybe a bit younger, in flat shares, the Wi-Fi is not so good, or if you've got very young children, they found it much more nightmarish experience. So for me, I've had it very productive, didn't have to commute, wasn't running around London all the time. Good experience, and that's probably the experience of a lot of older people, but not for others. So there's a kind of, you have to sort of work out where people are in life when you're judging how it's working for them.
Well, I think that's a really important point, Craig, and it links to this broader question of well-being. So in this report, we're talking about this notion of healthy hybrid, but we're connecting it to a broader commitment to well-being for employees. And I don't think that people should underestimate the kind of ramifications of a genuine commitment to well-being at work. This is not just about avoiding people having industrial accidents, or even just about people dropping out of work because of anxiety or stress. It's actually a positive commitment to people enjoying their working lives. And that has many, many implications, I think. But one of them, exactly as you said, Craig, is it means that employers are going to have to think a little bit more about the relationship between work and the individual circumstances of their employees. Now, if you go back a few years, or if you look at this through a kind of traditional master and servant view of the workplace, well, that's nothing to do with employers. Employers say, well, this is the employment contract, take it or leave it. And, if you have to travel 2 hours into work, well, that's, that's your choice. And, if I work from home and, you've got difficult domestic circumstances, well, that's for you to solve. It's not my problem. You've taken the job and this is the contract and this is how we work. We're talking about a very different world when employers say, no, actually, I am going to try to take consideration of the circumstances of your life. Now, we've seen a bit of this in the past because of the right that people have to request flexible working and the growth of flexible working. So this isn't a brand new concept. And by the way, this is a general point, by the way, about, and RSA has done a lot of work on this, about the relationship between crisis and change. When you have a crisis like this, things don't come from nowhere, but what happens is that things which were there already get accelerated. And so these kinds of questions, employers thinking about the circumstance of individual employees, taking health and well-being seriously, these were there already, but it seems to me they've been accelerated during the crisis. And we've now reached a point where it's difficult to imagine going back to a world where responsible employers said, your personal domestic circumstances and the impact it has on your working life is of no consideration to me.
And do you think that actually increasingly we're going to see people saying, well, if you aren't taking these things seriously enough, I'm off and I'll move, and people will struggle to get good employees?
Yeah, I mean, look, it will vary, and Craig, it's an important point to make, and I'm not making it just to be kind of pious, but let's remember in all of this that there are millions of people, and those people tend to be at the bottom end of the labour market, for whom hybrid working is not a relevant issue at all, because you can't be a hybrid nurse in a hospital, you can't be a hybrid dustman, refuse collector, you can't be a hybrid Uber driver. You've got to be there and you've got to do it. So it's important to remember that, and that is significant, I think, because one of the things we've got to watch here is a further kind of embedding of a dual labour market, where there are some people who enjoy good work and good pay and all the things that come with that, and then there's the other half of the labour market that are kind of locked out, having a very different kind of experience. So we have to remember that this hybrid working only applies to certain people, and that's relevant to your question, because it depends whether or not you're talking about employees who have choice. So if after September, when the furlough unfolds, furlough is wound up and we have much higher unemployment, there will be a lot of people who don't have a great deal of choice because they need work. But in companies where the workforce is largely a graduate workforce, where the company is really trying to recruit people on the basis of their educational qualities, etc., then I think health and well-being are going to be very significant factors for workers. So they'll be significant in terms of who you can recruit exactly as you said, Craig, because people will be starting to ask in interviews and when they talk to other people about, is this a good firm to work for? That'll be these are the questions they'll be asking. It's important to retention, because whether or not you can stay in a job, and significantly, Craig, whether you can stay in a job when your circumstances change. That's been a massive issue for women. Has been, well, this job is fine, but hang on, now I'm pregnant or now I've got a young child, it doesn't work so well for me and there's no flexibility. So retention is about a firm that says, actually, as your life changes, as your priorities change, we will try to work with you to do that. So absolutely, recruitment and retention will be strongly influenced by this. And don't forget, now we live in the world of Glassdoor. We live in the world where before people go and work for a firm, they go and look at what other people say about working for that firm, and health and well-being will be something that they'll be reading about. And if they say, well, this is a firm I work for, I got well paid, but my goodness, the anxiety and stress levels were enormous. There was no flexibility. My boss was not sympathetic at all to issues that I had. Well, a lot of people say, well, I'm not going to even, be putting my name forward to work for that employer.
So let's try and unpack the report in terms of like the very broad things, physical and mental health. Broadly, what did you discover in terms of the physical side of things?
Yeah, so the major finding, which isn't from our own research, we were looking at research done by other organisations, it is this issue of, whether or not your domestic circumstances enable you to work in a way which is physically safe. And there is evidence of people having musculoskeletal issues, back pain, neck pain, etc. And that's from large surveys, seems pretty undeniable. So obviously one of the questions that we're going to have to look at here is, if we're going to make hybridity, people working from home, something which is a norm in a normal world, not just a response to a particular crisis, companies are going to have to look at where their responsibilities lie and to ensure that the people working from home have got the right equipment and context to work.
Does that mean businesses giving employees at home decent chairs, or what does it mean?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely may be about that, or allowing people to claim or having schemes which, like schemes that enable you to buy a bicycle to get to work, schemes which enable you to get the right kit so that you're less likely to end up having to kind of conduct your meetings lying on your back or whatever it might be. So yeah, absolutely. And that's part of a range of issues about what happens when the workplace is in the home. Where does responsibility lie? And there's all sorts of complications, but I mean, one of them, which I don't think we pick up on the report particularly, but if your company, you've got a commitment when it comes to carbon emissions, do you need to consider the costs, the effects of the fact that you've got people working from home with their central heating on all day? Is that something which you need to factor in to your assessment of your carbon impacts, for example? So yeah, this issue of making sure people have got the right equipment at home is one of a suite of issues which are raised by the idea that I am working for you, I'm doing what you want, I'm your employee, but I'm working at home.
And one of the things that Vitality has been very clearly associated with is actually encouraging people to be more physically active, make sure that they get a certain number of steps a day or take proper exercise, that sort of thing. That's something we've seen drop off in lockdown, isn't it? That because people aren't commuting or that kind of thing, that they're maybe not doing as much physical activity as they perhaps should.
One of the recommendations we make is that everybody should have, or all companies should ensure that people have 30 minutes every day, which is dedicated to them being able to, stretch or do Pilates or yoga or whatever it might be, so that they're not, I mean, we all have good days and bad days, but certainly all of us have had those days when, you're just on Zoom or Teams or webinar, whatever it is, all day, focus, hunched forward, sometimes quite intense stuff, and you don't realize until lunchtime or the end of the day you try and stand up, you think, and so it's important, Vitality and employers help employees do that, because we all want to look after our health, but unless we're actually told, look, now you need to just kind of log off, you need to do some stretching, you need to go for a run, whatever it is you need to do. If we're not reminded to do it, the danger is that we don't do it, and we don't find out until 5 o'clock when we can't stand, or 6 o'clock when we can't stand up properly, that we've been sitting in a bad position all day.
So it's interesting, Matthew, that the 30-minute movement break is coming up on the chat function, saying, that we should do that to encourage people to not have such a sedentary lifestyle. How can employers or HR effectively encourage that in a way that it's effective? Is there strategies businesses should use to encourage that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the broad thrust of our argument is that companies need to take issues of health and well-being really seriously, right up to kind of board level. There needs to be a clear mandate in terms of their commitment to health and well-being for employees wherever they are, including working from home. And you need that seriousness because if you're a manager, you work in an organization, you're under pressure. As we all know, middle managers are the ones who kind of get the most pressure in organizations, generally speaking. You're a middle manager, you're under targets, you're working with a team. You need to be told that giving that team 30 minutes off in a day when you might feel under pressure to be working intensively with them for 10 hours to deliver an outcome, that that's not just a nice thing to do. That is a requirement. That is an expectation that is placed on you. That's why this stuff has to go to the top. In the kind of day-to-day pressures in any organization, if you're simply saying, oh, it would be good if you thought about health and well-being, it's just it's perfectly not because people are bad. It's perfectly natural that it doesn't feel like a priority when you're under pressure. That's why you have to say, no, we take this seriously. We take it seriously at board level. We measure it. We talk to our staff about it. And you as a manager are required. You are required to make sure that people have 30 minutes a day when they're not on a call. And we'll look at people's diaries and make sure that that is actually being implemented. And I've seen other examples of this. We talk about the 30 minutes, but in my own organization in the RSA, something we did halfway through lockdown was simply to say that all meetings started at 5 past the hour, because there was a kind of tendency for people to have back-to-back meetings. And of course, what that sometimes means is that people in a meeting go, oh, we can go on now till 4 minutes past because the next meeting isn't until 5 minutes past, which rather misses the point. But so, we're learning all the time, but there are practices that we need to embed.
So, but yeah, exactly. So what we've tried increasingly to do it to now is make sure that there is a scheduled break where you don't do phone calls and stuff. So some of that is actually also telling people it's okay and relying on it. I wanted to sort of move to the sort of mental health aspect of this, because this is perhaps more difficult. One of the things, a lot of people have struggled at home, and some of that is to do with lack of interaction. If you're living on your own, or even if you're living with people that are in a stressful environment because you've got young children or a relationship that's not great. Let's talk a bit about the sort of the mental side of it and what the report found, and then maybe what businesses should be thinking and doing on that. So what did it find in terms of mental health?
Yeah, so this is, I think, it goes back to something I said earlier, Craig, which is kind of interesting, which is that people's account of working from home during lockdown suggests that people have been working more intensively and have suffered higher levels of anxiety. But then if they're asked whether they want to return to the office, overwhelmingly people say no, they want to work, if it's possible, if their job allows it, to work in a hybrid way. So I think what people are saying is, I really enjoy having the opportunity of working from home, but I need it to be done in a way that is doesn't feel like it's a kind of crisis response, but feels like it's a properly structured way of doing things that's fully integrated in the way that I work. And this, I think, is, as I say, this is the big issue, as you said at the beginning, Craig. What changes in June? What changes in June is we are no longer in the world of adapting to a crisis. We're in the world of creating new ways of working, which are based upon our sense of what is right for employees, what is right for employers. So I think what people are saying is, my experience of working from home through lockdown has been pretty mixed, but I want to keep the good bits of it, even if the bad bits of it hopefully can be put behind me. So it may be that I can't work from home every day of the week, and that working from home every day of the week has been quite stressful for me, but I can work 2 days a week from home, or I can work mornings from home, and I want to be able to do that. So So it's not that people have enjoyed working from home so much that they're desperate to hold on to it. It's that they have enjoyed parts of it and they would like to hold on to those parts, whilst at the same time having the opportunity to meet people face to face. I mean, overwhelmingly, people have missed those kind of face to face interactions. They've missed the sociability of work and they want to get back to that. And so that's why healthy hybrid looks like the best of all possible worlds.
So businesses might say, look, I'm totally sympathetic to this. I understand, let's try and find a good way. But at the end of the day, we also do need to turn a profit, make things work. And there's a danger that, you might think that I need 1 day a week in the office, or you might think I need 5 days a week in the office. And then meetings are sort of, some people are home, some people aren't. And you can see that there might be a bit of chaos. Is that something that's just going to settle down and we'll end up with a pattern that everybody holds on to, or do you think it can be more fluid than that?
Yeah, so it's a really important point, Craig, and it takes us to another area of recommendation within the report, which is, staff engagement is absolutely critical to this. And as I'm sure you've noticed, Craig, one of the things that's happened during crisis has been a real step change in staff engagement. Organizations have had to, in a whole variety of ways. So organizations that might have surveyed their staff once a year have been surveying their staff once a month to find out how they're doing, how they're coping. I heard about a company where it used to be that the chief executive would every 3 months do a rather pompous talk to a rather bored staff group who would feel they had to kind of listen in. And he had moved to a weekly fireside chat from his front room. So something quite interesting has happened amongst good employers in relation to a much deeper level of engagement. And I think it's critical on this, and I say this as a chief executive, if you as an organization take the complexities of hybrid working, that there is not a kind of right answer, where there are dangers with everything that we do. So for example, there is a real danger that the people who can come into the office feel that people who can't come into the office, for whom it is much better to work from home mainly, feel that the people going into the office are getting bits of information, bits of feedback, getting noticed by their manager in a way that they're not, and that they're being discriminated against as a consequence of that. Equally, those people coming into the office might be saying, well, why am I having to commute an hour and a half a day and all the stress of that? And other people are able to kind of pad into their office in their slippers at 1 minute to 9. So now, what I'd say is this: if you run an organization and your approach is, I want to control this, me, the chief executive, the HRD or whatever, we're going to sit down and we're going to work out a plan and we're going to tell the staff what we're going to do, you're on a hide into nothing. Because then all the problems and the trade-offs and the difficulties will all be blamed on you because your scheme doesn't work. What you really need to do is to sit down with your staff group, people who are genuinely representative of the staff, who are independently able to speak their mind, who know they can speak their mind without any kind of impact on their kind of recriminations on their kind of career or whatever, and say, look, here's the problem. We've, exactly as you say, Craig, we've got to be a successful organization. We've got to serve our customers. We've got to compete. Well, people understand that. People aren't stupid. But we want to give you the working patterns that you want. But we want to do that in a way that is fair across the workforce. Engage your staff, and then your staff will help you solve that problem, which means you'll come up with a better solution. But it also means that if there are some challenges, some downsides, some difficulties, some teething problems, rather than the leader of the organization being blamed for it, staff representatives will say to staff colleagues, look, we're working this out as we go along. Be patient. Let's see where we're getting to. There's no kind of conspiracy behind all of this. So staff engagement is absolutely critical to getting this right.
And so interesting. I think a lot of the people that will be listening to this will be going, okay, well, what's the return on investment on all of this? So how are we actually going to demonstrate that this is actually good for the business and it actually productivity goes up, or that that it impacts on the bottom line in a positive way? Is there evidence in the report that actually deploying some of these strategies actually works for a healthy business and actually makes it successful in terms of a financial approach?
Yeah, so I've mentioned two. which is recruitment of the staff that you want and retention of the staff that you want. Linked to that is productivity. There is some evidence that people's productivity rose during lockdown, despite the kind of issues, whether it's back pain or anxiety or whatever it might be. So it looks as though letting people work in the place they most want to work to is good in terms of their overall productivity. And also there's the kind of reputation that you have. Do you want to have a reputation as a company which treats people well? Word of mouth from your employees is that it's a great organization. Or you want to be a company that's seen as being inflexible, out of touch, behind the times, not really caring. So, you know, in a world where non-material assets now are much greater than traditional capital assets, things like reputation are critically important to brands, then this is part of that. So I think there's a number of ways intuitively that one would say that a deep commitment to health and well-being in your workforce, including healthy hybrid, will contribute to your bottom line. Now, how that exactly works out for you as an organization is something which, you know, depends on what you do, and it depends on the nature of your workforce and the particular issues that are generated. But I certainly think it's perfectly possible, particularly in a larger company, it's got the capacity to evaluate this kind of thing, to as you start to implement these kinds of policies, to be able to have metrics which will demonstrate to you that this is a good investment. And it's important to do that because this is not a one-off, Craig. I mean, you know, this is not going to be about a set of things that we do at the end of June and go, great, that's it. You know, health and well-being done, healthy hybrid, that's done. This is the beginning of a longer process of really quite deep changes to the way in which we think about work and the responsibilities of employers and the expectations of employees.
I think it's a really good point, isn't it? Because I think people are thinking that we'll suddenly click our fingers and it'll settle. But in reality, it's probably going to take a number of years for people to find a kind of equilibrium that really works.
Yeah. And you know, the funny thing is, Craig, we all have our own hunches about this, don't we? You know, I mean, it's a kind of virtual dinner party topic, you know, isn't it? I mean, I've had several conversations with people where there are some people who go, oh, it's all baloney, we'll all be back in the office in, you know, 6 weeks, you know, versus those people who say it's the death of the office, you know, that the City of London's going to have to turn into a completely different kind of, you know, domain because there'll be nobody buying, you know, there's no future for anyone selling sandwiches in Canary Wharf because there'll be nobody there. So there's a kind of whole variety of people making predictions. The one thing I would say is clear is that nobody, you know, nobody actually knows what's going to happen, and precisely as you say, it will take time. So to go back to the thing that I said earlier, you know, it may be in the first 6 months that you're really enjoying working from home and you've decided to work from home almost entirely. And then after 6 months, you start to notice that the quality of relationship you've got with your manager doesn't seem to be as strong as the quality of relationship that people who are going into the office are having. Now, how do you respond to that? Do you respond to it by going into the office, even though you don't really want to, and that creates anxiety for you? Do you respond to it by going to your staff representative and saying, look, I think there's something happening here which is disadvantaging us working from home, and can we talk about it? So here's a little example of this. And it just shows, you know, some of the issues we're going to have to get into. And we are going to have to get into these, by the way. Anyone who's watching this and thinking, oh, I wish all this would just go away. It isn't going to go away. So, you know, the question is, do you step forward into it or do you wait for it to hit you? But an example I heard the other day was somebody had been in a meeting, 6 people, 3 of them were in the office and 3 of them were remote. And they had the first half of the meeting and then there was the comfort break. And when the 3 people in the office came back into the room, the 3 people online had a conversation online. And what they said to the 3 people in the office was, would you mind going to your terminals? Because we feel this is not a meeting of 6 people. This is a meeting of 3 people with 3 people external to it. And, you know, that's really interesting. How do we feel about that? You know, some people's reaction to that will be, that's absolutely preposterous. First of all, you want to work from home, and now you want to tell people in the office how they've got to work. Other people might say, no, that's perfectly reasonable. The fact of the matter is human communication is not just cognitive and verbal, it's all sorts of other things going on as well. And yes, that, you know, that would make me feel I wasn't really fully part of the meeting and make me feel there was an in group and an out group. Well, again, go back to what I said earlier. I don't think that's a decision that I would discourage managers from going, well, I'm going to decide. I would say, okay, well, let's talk about this. Let's engage staff in a conversation about this. Do we want to say all meetings will be conducted with everybody virtually, because not to do so will create a kind of two-tier feeling? Well, we're going to find out, Craig, aren't we?
We are. I'm seeing a lot of parallels between what we're talking about and actually the model that Vitality has as a business. So long before the pandemic, Vitality basically based its business on this idea of shared value, which is basically something that's good for the consumer, is good for the business, and good for wider society. So if you're encouraging people, incentivizing people to better physical and mental health, then that means that there will be fewer claims against your business, and you can plow that money back into the business. But also that has an impact on wider society. It's better if the general population is physically and mentally healthier. It seems to me that actually that kind of thinking actually applies here. Doing your best to have a happy and healthy workplace, it's sort of everybody's a winner, isn't it? It's sort of a win-win situation, not just for the business, not just for the worker, but for wider society.
Yeah, and I think it's a great concept. And by the way, it's a concept that I have mainly used in relation to public services, actually as a way of understanding the value of what public services provide. So yeah, it's a great concept, and one we refer to in the report. But the only thing I'd say is I completely get that, and I think overwhelmingly I agree. I've been an advocate of good work for several years now, and I've never thought that employers providing good work is anything other than good business. And I've not really met many enlightened employers who don't agree, to be honest. However, there's two things here. First of all, the point that we've been making repeatedly, which is it isn't going to be easy. It's a very important principle, but how you actually enact that principle in a way which is not just fair in terms of the priorities of the employer and the employee, but fair across different groups of employees, that's something we're going to have to kind of work on. And the second is we have to think about what these principles mean in the bad times as well as the good times. If you look at the history of corporate social responsibility, what you tend to find is that companies are very kind of keen on these values, but then when they face enormous pressures, retrenchment, a real sense of kind of losing market share, then often the principles go out of the window, because there's a kind of sense of we can't afford that stuff now because we're in trouble. And so this concept of shared value, it's really important, the positivity that it contains. But we also need to think about, and this is where, again, I would say staff engagement is so critical. What happens when it feels difficult? What happens when it feels as though the good ways in which we're treating people and the flexibility we're giving people is actually making it harder for us to compete with another company which is willing to really put pressure on its staff? Over the medium to long term, that won't work, but over the short term, it might. And so part of this strategy, I think, why we are saying staff engagement is so important to health, to the overall strategy of health and well-being, is you also sometimes have to go to the staff and say, look, we may not be able to give you everything you want right now because we've got to get through this. Overwhelmingly, in my experience, staff respond positively to that. They'll say, okay, we get it. As long as it's something that you're genuinely having to do and you want to go back to what we want to achieve together, then that's fine. But that's part of this. Shared value has got to be a concept that works in the difficult times as well as the good times.
Couple of questions coming through here. What needs to happen at a government policy level to help support workplace well-being in the new normal? Can you see, does government have a big role in this? Is legislation, guidance, that sort of thing? What do you think?
Yeah, again, I think I'd make a distinction here between the top half and the kind of, the bottom half of the labour market. I think broadly speaking, in professional companies dealing with kind of graduate workforces, I don't think government necessarily needs to intervene a great deal for precisely the reasons that we've talked about, Craig, which is that, there is a strong business argument to do the right thing. And so let businesses and employees kind of get on with it. And actually, as a strong advocate of better protection for workers, I think the framework of rights for employees, people who are full employees, is pretty reasonable. You know, I don't think there, in the report I did for Theresa May, I didn't argue for any strengthening of the rights that belong to full employees. However, where I think government does have a role is in relation to people who have more precarious forms of work, to people who have only worker status rather than employee status, to people who are wrongly described as being self-employed. So for me, the priority of public policy, and by the way, I believe this about all public policy, not just in this area, is in relation to those people least able to kind of defend themselves. So, you know, it's kind of interesting example of this today. Uber has reached this deal with GMB. And, you know, I was just talking to a journalist just before the session who said, well, is the danger now that, you know, Uber and GMB will do a deal which will somehow enable Uber to avoid its responsibilities? And I said, well, I don't really think there is a danger, but actually if Uber and GMB, which is a robust and independent trade union, can agree on something, well, fine, you know, let them get on with it. You know, I don't see why the government would want to interfere. I don't think GMB are a group of patsies who are just going to roll over. So, yeah, what the government needs to do is strengthen the rights of those people at the bottom end of the labour market, the precarious workers, the ones who suffered particularly during COVID. And we've been waiting for a long-awaited employment bill now for several years. We were hoping it'd be in the Queen's Speech. It wasn't in the Queen's Speech. So we'll just have to carry on pressing for the government to do a little bit more for those people who don't enjoy that full set of benefits that employees get.
Some more questions coming through on the chat. Paul Roberts, love the discussion. Hybrid is seen as a panacea by many. So why is every helpline, customer service line in the country going, we are exceptionally busy, please be patient and accept poor service? Does this suggest that hybrid isn't working?
Yeah, well, there are organisations that, you know, have long since shifted, for example, call centre services so that people can do them from home. So, I mean, I don't know what is, I mean, it's an interesting question. If you really want to know what I think a lot of companies use that as just a way of using inertia to stop people giving them a hard time. So, you know, how many of us have just given up on our complaint about our broadband or whatever else it might be, because after half an hour sitting waiting on the phone, we just can't be bothered anymore. So I think there's a bit of that going on. You know, at the moment, we still have relatively low unemployment because of the furlough. That might change. So maybe that some companies genuinely can't find people to do that work. Maybe they're not paying enough. But certainly, I think that I mean, most people would say in 5 years' time there'll be no call centre work anyway because it'll all be being done by AI. So that's another conversation. But certainly, that kind of work is a very good example of work that could be done better if people had the option of working from home, because, you know, people can then, and as I say, there are lots of companies that already do this. You know, you can log on and do a few hours customer service in the evening when the kids have gone to bed or whatever it might be. So I think that's an area where flexible work has really got, you know, benefits all round.
Yeah, hurry up on the connectivity, I think, for the government maybe. One of your key recommendations is health and well-being to be on the company risk register. It makes absolute sense, but has never happened. What's different and how can this become a reality?
Well, you know, most organisations take their risk registers pretty seriously, you know, and you know, they have their audit and risk committee, which will have on it the kind of people who have got the patience to really go through these registers properly and scrutinise them properly. That's certainly my experience at the RSA, which is that, you know, I have to say, as a chief executive, I find risk registers, I think, oh, it's quite hard work, but fortunately, doesn't rely on me and my sloppy ways. We've got our audit and risk committee, we've got our human resources department, and they take it terribly seriously. And if you have it on your risk register, people will then say, well, how are we assessing this risk? You know, yeah. If it's red, amber, or green, why is it amber? Why is it red? Why is it green? And that then means, oh, right, so I've got to have some criteria here. And then that will take you to, well, are we asking our staff how they feel? So the value for me of it being on the risk register is twofold. First of all, it sees health and well-being as an asset, like other assets, like the other things that are on the risk register, which are, you know, how do we protect our assets? And that's an important principle. And by the way, goes to an even bigger principle about the fact that one of the peculiarities of the way in which we think about organizations is that we see investment in capital, in things as investment, and investment in people as spending, as a cost. We don't think about investment in staff as investment. We don't count it as investment, and that's a bigger mindset change that we need to undertake. So the first thing it does is it helps people to think about health and well-being as an asset along with other assets. And then the second thing, as I said, Craig, is you can't have something on the risk register unless you're measuring it. Otherwise, it's completely tokenistic. And so those great folk on the Audit and Risk Committee who get their teeth into these things will quickly be saying, well, hang on, you've given yourself an amber green for health and well-being. Why? You know, what's the evidence for this? And, you know, if it goes amber red next time, well, what's gone wrong? And that is a good discipline. It doesn't do the work on its own, but it's a really good discipline.
Yeah. So we're coming to the end of our discussion, and in doing that, I just wanted to go back to the beginning. We said that we're standing on the cusp of real significant change, and we can't be 100% sure how that's going to happen. You're also doubling that by going to a new job. So standing on the cusp of significant change and having a new job. Do you have any thoughts about how you want to basically organise yourself in terms of hybrid working going into a new job because of the lessons you've learned in lockdown?
Yeah, so, you know, I'm going into an organisation which is considering these questions as we speak. It's one of the conversations I have with people before I start. And we've adopted what I think is the right position, which is an employee-friendly but pragmatic position, which is not to overcommit now to patterns and ways of working, but to basically say to people, work in the way that you want to work, and then let's see how this was worked out in 3 months and 6 months. I think that's the right approach to be taking. I think the fact that I'm going to run the NHS Confederation means that I will be thinking very hard about the health of the population, and healthy work is really important. You know, when I did my report for Theresa May, I said that good work mattered for a number of reasons, and one of those reasons was health. And I said, not only, you know, is there an issue, which is that bad work makes you sick, and it means that there are people who could be paying taxes who are on benefits because they've dropped out of work that has made them sick. But also, you know, one of the reasons why we'll all find it incredibly difficult to get a GP appointment right now is not just the backlog of COVID, but because there are people ahead of the line waiting to see the GP because work has made them sick. So, you know, there's a very big public interest here in health and well-being at work. And there are other elements to this. You know, overwhelmingly the evidence, for example, on mental illness, which might sound ironic because some people, their mental illness is exacerbated by work, but actually a much more important story here is that having a job is one of the most effective ways of tackling people's mental ill health. That if you can get people back into work, it starts to restore their morale, they have people to socialize with, etc. And one of the issues we as a society need to face, given the very high proportion of people now who have felt able to share the fact that they have mental illness challenges, is how do we work with people recognizing that they have those kinds of challenges. We've got to get, you know, we've got to get, Craig, fully away from a world that says, well, to work you must be not suffering from mental illness, and if you have mental illness, well then you must be out of the workplace. Instead, we've got to recognize there'll be a number of people who have ongoing issues around their mental health, and the question is going to be, how do we design work in order that they can deal with those issues and be really productive employees at the same time. So lots of ramifications here. And then more broadly, Craig, you know, I've been working on this kind of issue of good work for many years, and you know what really excites me is that I think that part of what's happened under COVID, the notion of healthy hybrid in this report, the broader commitment to well-being, can be part of a more profound shift. You know, really since industrialization and accelerated by Henry Ford and his kind of big deal at the beginning of the 20th century, which was, I'll pay you more money and I'll make my cars cheap, but the deal is your work's going to be, you know, pretty soul destroying, but that's the deal. You know, that instrumental model, which is I work to get money and I don't expect anything from work but money, and then I'm going to spend my money to relieve me of the kind of burdens of having to do this job. You know, we spend half our waking hours as adults in work, and as a societal ideal, we ought to have the idea that that we feel that work is simply the way in which we express ourselves as human beings, that we don't leave ourselves at home when we work, and indeed, more profoundly, that the whole idea of work-life balance might one day be looked on as archaic, because it would be, well, it's not work-life balance, it's work-life integration, because work is part of your life and part of how you fulfill yourself, not the kind of notion of, well, life is the great bit and work is the bit, and how do we balance these two? So there's a deeper possibility here that as a society, we get to where we say, well, of course, you know, people should find their work fulfilling. I said, my last line, Craig, you know, I said in the first page of my report in 2017, that our aspiration should be for a country and economy where all work is fair and decent, and all work offers scope for fulfillment and development. And I still adhere very strongly to that ideal. And I think that ideal has actually come a bit closer because of the way in which we responded to COVID.
That's really fascinating. And I think that we can end the discussion on a really fascinating note, that we can see something that potentially, that there's a rebalancing here that is really works, not just for the physical, but the mental health of society in general. Good luck with going to the NHS Confederation. It's an incredibly important institution, and I think we can all agree, having listened to you over the last hour, that it's going to be in very good hands. But we were also very lucky that you were able to do this report, because I think it's a really important one and a really useful one. And we've learned a huge amount from it. It's incredibly timely and lots of really fascinating outcomes from it. So Matthew Taylor, I want you to imagine that there's a virtual standing ovation going on now. And say thank you very much for what you're doing.
Thank you, everybody. I really enjoyed it. Cheers.
Really, thank you, Matthew, and thank you to Vitality as well.